Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's California Mobility Center webinar, a capital markets perspective on the electric and autonomous vehicle sectors. Everyone is in listen-only mode. However, you are encouraged to ask questions by using the Q&A box. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to all CMC members following the presentation. At this time, I would like to turn the webinar over to Senior Partner of the Office of the CEO at CMC, Scott Ungerer.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the November edition of the CMC Thought Leadership series on advanced mobility. As Catherine said, I'm Scott Ungerer. I've been working with the CMC since before it was the CMC, and I'm joined here today with the CMC COO, Mark Rawson. So he will provide some color commentary, throughout the session. We're very excited to have, or at least I am, very excited to have this session today dealing with the capital markets perspective on what's going on in this mobility space. Funding and company valuations and connection with investors are important to every company in the space, regardless if you've been around for 50 years or 5 months. The understanding what is in the mind of us investors is a daunting task, even for us, quite frankly. But here today we have Storm Duncan from Jefferies, and I just spent a minute. I don't know how many of you are very familiar with investment bankers and the approach they take to business. But I met Storm by coincidence earlier this year when the two companies that we were working with, which were both early stage companies, were talking about some business prospects between them, and I immediately saw in Storm a sort of a different personality coming out from an investment banker. He's got a tremendous perspective. He's very authentic, and I think as soon as I saw him, I put his name down on the list and said, I've got to figure out how we get Storm into the audience of the CMC and share his thinking. So here we are today, and as the saying goes, for some of you that may remember it, without further ado, I introduce Storm Duncan. Thanks, Storm.
Great, thank you, and apologies, we were running a little late and it was entirely my fault. I lost Wi-Fi in my house, amazingly, that I'm visiting, so tremendous apologies to everybody. What I thought I'd probably do and would be most helpful to everybody is walk through 3 things about autonomous and electric vehicles, and then I believe we're going to have some time for Q&A. Scott and Mark, is that correct at the end?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I'll do that, and I think what I thought would be the best approach is to talk about where did we come from, where are we right now, and where are we heading, and give you a at least a pretty educated capital markets view on this aspect. So where did we come from? So for getting the actual factual information as to who was developing electric vehicles, 50 years ago or 40 years ago, and autonomous vehicles 20 years ago, I'm going to try to do it a little bit more from a mass market perspective, because that's what the capital markets care about more than anything. So, 10 years ago, which is not that long ago, and it seems kind of odd, almost 0 people were really focused on, broad scale electrification or AV like they are now. And maybe it's 15 years ago. I'm just kind of trying to pick a random number, so you had Tesla really focused on electrification, and despite what their marketing is, an ADAS program, you had Waymo doing ADAS, which eventually evolved to AV, and that was the program I was most involved with. And they evolved to AV just because they just didn't think level 3 was something sustainable or safe for humanity. So that's how they did that. Whereas Tesla kind of has made the opposite viewpoint. And we can talk about why Tesla made that decision. I think it was slightly more economic and technology oriented than safety oriented. And then you had Uber, which was focused really on the aggregation of transportation modalities and geographies. So transportation as a service or mobility as a service. And really, when I went around and talked to companies about any of these three companies, so I'd go around and I'd spend time with the large OEMs or people that were involved in and around the transportation space, and I would say, hey, you should really be talking to these companies, even including buying Tesla. Back when it was a very small company. And as you know, at Google, we tried to make an attempt to save Tesla at one point. That's all in the press, so I'm sure you can all read that. But people were just like laughing and scornful at that concept. They're like, look, Tesla's the next DeLorean of the market. None of this stuff will work. We've all tried all these programs over time. And this is, these are all failed concepts. So that was kind of like one major part of where we came from, and it'll be important as to getting to the present as well. The other thing that was happening that was not at all correlated to autonomous or electric vehicle that will impact probably the electric vehicle and autonomous vehicle market from a capital markets perspective more than anything was the devaluation of the public markets as a form of financing across the United States. So, after the financial crash, and even before that, there were a lot of regulations put in place, like the Sarbanes-Oxley Acts, to make sure, the accounting and stuff was legitimate. There was and continues to be a very short-term oriented mindset in the market versus long-term mindset. So the very few companies that have been able to have a long-term mindset have all been technology companies, like Amazon is a good example. Google, et cetera, have had very long-term mindsets versus short-term mindsets. And all the companies that are, that haven't had that tremendous amount of momentum from their underlying markets have had to really be reactive to the market's short-term demands. And that's really hard for a company to manage on a short-term basis. So what you saw is a lot of I'll get to that in a second. And then there was a lot of cash flow EPS valuation metrics back then, instead of growth-oriented metrics and future-oriented metrics, which correlate to the quarterly results. So instead of being able to actually invest in the future, you had to really manage your earnings per share projections. And so what happened is, as private companies just got frustrated with the public markets, and there wasn't really this desire to say, like, I took my company public, people would stay public. So if you look at 3 or 4 years ago, before the most recent boom, at all the companies that are, a lot of them are now public, they were 30, 40, 50. There's $100 billion private companies now that are out raising billions and billions of dollars in the private capital markets because they didn't want to be public. Uber, Stripe, in the payment space, et cetera. And they stay private as long as they can. And so the wealth creation transitioned from mutual fund managers, of 20 years ago to private equity firms and VCs and startup founders. So there's this big transfer of wealth creation and what we call alpha, the creation of abnormal returns to all these categories of people like VCs and founders and employees at tech startups, et cetera. So these evolutions also coincided with a lot of technology evolutions, the technology and computing power and communications capabilities with 4G and 5G advanced to make things more probable at the same time that the capital markets were not willing to allow these sort of investments to happen. And then the culture started to evolve, I'd say around social responsibility and environmental issues. So that's kind of where we came from. So then the question is where are we right now? From an AV perspective, I think this group knows this better than anybody, right? The last portion of making AV fluent, so to speak, is super hard. And this is also true in language, natural language processing. So to take and have my voice be speaking right now in fluent French, computers can do that about 93, 94% accurately, but a human brain works 100% accurately. And so I think that's the challenge that you see with natural language processing, and the same thing with autonomous vehicles. That last part is, you can listen to someone speaking French that's being translated real time, and you'll understand exactly what they're saying, but it's not completely fluent. And that's the same thing with a car. And the problem is that society is willing to let as long as I kill someone else in my car when I'm drunk, that's more acceptable to society than if a vehicle does it. And what I mean is If I tell you, hey, we just invented this safe driving program for new drivers that reduces accidents by 99.5%, of all new drivers don't get into accidents during their entire lifetime, at a ratio reduction of 99.5%, it would immediately get enacted into law that you have to take that program before you can get a driver's license. Everybody would be on it and society would be much safer. And then when someone actually killed someone or got into an accident in a car, it would, there would still be litigation and payments made, but it's understandable to humans. But if it's a computer doing that, people won't tolerate that. They can't understand the concept of being killed by a non-human entity that's out there. So that's kind of a big challenge, because that threshold of how safe these cars are versus humans is inconsistent with the mindset of humanity. And that will eventually change, but that's one of the big obstacles. Electrification, of course, has numerous hurdles as well. The availability of the underlying chemicals, energy availability. We all think, I'm not sure how we got to this place of thinking that, there's abundant energy when we have brownouts in California, even still today at this point in time. But there's, that's going to be an obstacle for vehicles. And the disposal of the technology at end of life will increasingly become something that's more obvious to people, right? Because that's a future problematic current problem. So those are the kind of technology and societal constraints that we see that we're dealing with. And that impacts markets a lot, because markets aren't willing to invest in some of these things if these societal constraints are out there and existing. And then now the capital markets, turning towards the capital markets point of view, the capital markets really got ahead of the end markets. And what I mean by that is disruption really has very few end beneficiaries, right? Other than the customer of that product. So the end beneficiaries are, as I mentioned before, founders, tech people, VCs, private equity firms, growth funds, all these private investors. And that's who's, if you go look around all of the private islands around the world, they're going to be owned by those people, or the yachts are now owned by those people, more than anybody else. And so what happened is the public markets have been, all the people in the public markets who are compensated to generate alpha are trying to figure out a way to get that alpha back into the public markets. And so when SPACs evolved, which is one of the primary topics that's really impacted AV and EV, when SPACs evolved over the last couple of years. So they've been around for 20 years. They've always kind of been to use an analogy for this group, they've been the used car parking lot of the financial markets is probably the best metaphor for them. But when SPACs came around, what happened is the SPACs were able to take companies public historically that haven't been able to take public. That's been their primary audience. And SPACs do very well during downturns because there's a lack of capital. And during upturns, it's very hard for SPACs to survive, because companies that could get public, even at the periphery during a good time, can probably get public. And so you don't need a SPAC. Well, during this most recent disruption, some people took some companies public in the autonomous vehicle space, both autonomous and electric vehicle, in the LiDAR space as an example. And I'll talk about why LiDAR was one that was very hot in a second. But what was happening is the SPACs became a vehicle for public investors to invest in venture level investments that they didn't have access to before. So public investors have charters that limit them from what they can do, and investing in private startup VC companies is not within their charter. But once it's a public company, they can invest in it. So if a SPAC takes a company public that really should be a venture oriented company for a few more years, it's basically taking creating a vehicle for venture investment. And so what you saw is all these institutional investors rushed into that. And the reason for that is if you're an institutional investor, you get compensated for your performance. And what was happening is, as I mentioned earlier, is all of the value creation was happening before a company got public. So Uber goes public at 60 billion. So it goes from 0 to $60 billion in 7 years. And then when it goes public over a 3 or 4 year period, it goes to maybe 100 billion, right? So you're getting that, that return of 60 to 100 billion, right? So you're getting a 66% return over several years. But the people that invested in Uber at a $5 million pre-money got the valuation increase from 5 million to 60 billion, right? And so now what was happening is you're putting that ability to capture the alpha out there in a vehicle that they could invest in. And so all of the venture firm, all the public investors rushed into these investments, and it created a supply demand imbalance for quite a while. And you saw a flood of SPACs coming out in the electronic vehicle space, the full stack autonomous vehicle space, on the trucking side, on the LiDAR side, et cetera. And you will notice that like a lot of, like, you know, if I'm looking at autonomous vehicles, I'd say I would invest in radar as an example, right? Because it's necessary not just for our level, you know, 2 and 3, in addition to level 4 and 5, but it's going to be on every single vehicle, and no one questions the need for radar, right? Whereas LiDAR, people still question the need for it. It's years away. It's expensive still. There's a lot of technological development left on that and a lot of risk left with it. But the thing is it's been in the press a lot. So whenever you hear about autonomous vehicles, what the people on Wall Street hear about is LiDAR, you know, because the Elon Musk debate, it's on top of the vehicles. When they see one driving down the street, they're like, what's that spinny thing? And so things like LiDAR got the attention of the public markets, which, you know, if I'm an investor with my knowledge level, you know, with 90 LiDAR companies out there in the market competing, it's probably not my first area of venture capital investment that I would make, you know, especially like whoever just happens to get to the public markets first. But regardless, that's what happened is you had this big supply demand imbalance and then a massive inflow of capital into SPACs. And that's how I would say the biggest inflow of capital into this sector occurred over the last several years. And you can look at some of the valuations that happened. Like, so as an example, one of the LiDAR companies, I'm not going to go into names, and it's not, nobody's trying to deceive anybody, right? They're just trying to get capital to grow their company. But one of the LiDAR companies had a valuation that was at one point, that was 2 times the entire size of the revenue of the LiDAR market in 7 years. Right. So that shows you the disparity of valuations. And I'm assuming that just how I said that is obvious, that that's not a legitimate valuation or supportable valuation. Is probably pretty fair to say. That was probably most of last year and the first part of this year. And then I think what started to happen is there was a lot of disruptions in the SPAC market. People were starting to do sillier and sillier deals out, you know, not just inside the autonomous and electrical vehicle space, but outside of it. The SPAC market and the private investment in public equity, the PIPE market, also got clogged up, and that's really slowed down the SPAC market and the ability to get it done. And I think also public investors who are really measured on their quarterly and annual performance, both for compensation and in terms of generating new capital from investors. We're starting to realize that a company that has a 5-year investment return horizon might not be the best use of their capital, where they're being measured, you know, quarterly and annually. And then the second aspect of it, I think, was that there's a portion of your capital that you're willing to put into that higher risk section and a portion you're not. And so once you put a bunch of money into these SPACs last year, you know, you're kind of at your risk level, your tolerance level for that amount of capital. And then I think probably the final thing that was important is that, you know, the public markets don't like capital intensive sectors. And for all intents and purposes, you know, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles are still very, very capital intensive. Then the next major topic I'll talk about is the land grab for ownership of the first dollar in consumer. So that's the capital markets perspective. And then the reason that a lot of these companies were needing so much capital, so it's obvious on the hardware oriented, even if they're hardware wrapped software, like a you know, a full stack autonomous vehicle company. A lot of the aspects of this that were capital intensive were gaining market share. The one truism that we've learned in technology in the 30 years since I've been in the sector is that very few people win. You know, it's usually a monopolistic winner or an oligopolistic set of winners in any space in technology. So if you look over time, eventually it gravitates to where there's just a Google or there's an Uber and a Lyft, you know, but it rarely turns out to a thing where there's like, oh, there's 10, you know, equal market share leaders in the space, all duking it out all day long. And so the thing that happened in the autonomous vehicle space is this land grab for what I call first dollar, you know. And so the first dollar used to be owned, let's look at consumer transportation, but this is true across all forms of modalities. If in consumer transportation, the first dollar was being battled out by all of the OEMs. And so if someone bought your car, you know, 20, 30, 40 years ago, they bought it from you, they would usually take it to your service center to get serviced and fixed and repaired and painted. And then they would sell it to you for a used car and buy a new car. So you owned that company and the customer and the life cycle of the company. And some of that devalued over time. There were things like, service stations would come up that would change your oil, or tire specialist companies would be out there so you can get your tires changed elsewhere, et cetera. But in essence, you owned a significant chunk of the downstream revenue. What happened with RideHailing, as an example, was they had the opportunity to displace all of the OEMs, and they wanted that first market share. And so what that meant is if they could capture your desire to hop in a car and have it be in their vehicle versus your vehicle increasingly, and it was your choice to go to their system versus Lyft. So if you're Uber, you're trying to get them on your platform. And you could capture more and more of their time in vehicle, and eventually they go from 2 vehicles to 1 vehicle, and then in the very, very far distant future to no vehicles, because it just becomes a service. Then you actually control that entire transportation dollar stream. And so it's very important to control the decision of the decision of these people to have their first dollar spent with you. Because once you did that, then you controlled all the OEM streams. So if everyone's coming to you first, then instead of what's happening now, where you have a balance sheet of an individual. So Uber says, I'm not going to buy all these vehicles. I'm going to pay someone to buy the vehicle themselves on their balance sheet, and then I'll pay them an income stream to use both the vehicle and their time to drive that vehicle, right? So off balance sheet financing for transportation. So once you get convinced them to be in that stream, then over time, you control as things either move autonomous or as you start to become larger and larger, you can go to OEMs and say, I'd like a purpose-built vehicle where a driver can drive multiple people, for shared transportation. And I'll order 1 million of these, right? So now the OEM is the second person in line instead of the first person in line sharing vehicles. And then of course, when it becomes autonomous, the question is will Waymo be able to have its own network and then therefore win, or will the networks then say, no, Waymo, you have to put your vehicles on my network? And so you see there's different perspectives on that, right? So Waymo has chosen a hybrid model through their partnership with Lyft. Cruise has not chosen a model like that yet. And then of course you have Uber, who decided to get rid of its autonomous vehicle effort and Lyft, and decide that the network had the power. So that's still an open question, but that's the land grab that's been going on. And that's a very expensive game to play to acquire the consumer. So that's why there's been so much money spent on the software/services companies that aren't hardware oriented. And then the last part of this, before we turn over to questions, and I know it's a lot of content, so hopefully it's adding value to you here, is where are we going? So now you know where we've been and where we are. Where are we going? So the electric and autonomous vehicle of the future, it's moving much faster than I think all of us thought before the press got involved. But it's moving slower than the press thinks it's moving. It's probably the right way of thinking about it. When I first got into the space, I didn't think we'd be where we are today as fast as we are. But if you speak to the press, we're a couple years away from someone's kid being killed by an autonomous vehicle, bouncing around the fields of your farm in Wyoming, right? So that's the big aspect. So the autonomous future, I believe, will be led by the reverse engineering of a lot of the capabilities of autonomous vehicles into ADAS technologies. So instead of ADAS building up the autonomous vehicles, the things that are working best in autonomous vehicles will be put into vehicles through ADAS, and people will kind of frog in the boiling pot, right? Like, Distronic cruise control. After you get used to that, it's like, then you realize that's all Tesla's autonomous vehicle program, originally was, is Distronic, which Mercedes had long before that, right? So it's about getting people used to some of the technologies that they have, like, self-parking vehicles, Distronic lane change, et cetera. And once more and more of these technologies get, people get comfortable with more and more of these technologies, then I think you start to see a lot more comfort with autonomous vehicles, because accidents will decrease, et cetera. Electrification, of course, will be required for many reasons, because of peak oil having already been achieved, because of environmental reasons, because of younger generations being very focused on, environmental footprint. Even if electrification doesn't achieve that, it's believed to achieve that. And so the winners on this will all be the well-capitalized innovators and acquirers. Waymo, Tesla, Amazon will be a definite winner in this, Alibaba. The second aspect of technology I mentioned earlier are the network effects. So there's a belief now that transportation is multimodal and there's benefit from shared usage, right? And so that multimodal transportation or shared usage require network effects to succeed. So the more customers you have, the more demand you have for your cars and drivers or scooters or whatever the modality is. And then of course, the more cars and drivers and modalities you buy, the more customers you have because their wait time is less, their costs are less as it gets amortized and used more. So the more cars and drivers you have, the better experience you can have for customers, not just lower wait times, but then you can start to parse your vehicles between like, oh, you're a professional and you're working, I'll give you a car with a desk, or oh, you live far from town, why don't I just send a car to you every morning that has a gym in it, so you can do a couple pieces of workout things, right? So if you have the biggest network and you're controlling all of transportation, you can start to create experiences in those vehicles, which is what we spend a lot of time on at Waymo discussing. And then once you have the network growth spiral, it's very hard for people not to use your use your technology. Sorry, I'm just clear this thing out from here. Okay, apologies for that. Get this notification out of the way here. Okay. There we go. Okay. And so then once you have this network growth spiral, it'll be very challenging for other people to keep up. And then you will become the Google of transportation, which will be either an Uber or a Cruise or a Waymo or something like that. So it does feel like it has all of the aspects of what it would take to make this a natural monopoly. And it could potentially be an oligopoly, but my suspicion is it'll be a natural monopoly. And the important part to know about a natural monopoly from a capital markets perspective is there's abnormal returns. So the capital markets very much like natural monopolies. I think the challenge from a natural monopoly perspective, though, is that it eventually attracts the attention of the governments, and the government has to come in and regulate. And the government really hasn't figured out how to regulate natural monopolies quite yet. And they're in the process of trying to learn this through, their efforts with Facebook and Google and Amazon, all these companies that have networks, which are natural monopolies. And so there'll probably be a lot more evolution between now and then. But my suspicion is it gets regulated like a utility, which are natural monopolies as well, right? So public utilities, and even if you're a private utility, you're limited a lot on the rates you can charge, et cetera. So I think you'll see a lot of emphasis by the capital markets on this natural monopoly aspect and how these things will get regulated. And then I think the last probably two things I would say, one is I believe my perspective is there'll be nationalization of transportation. Scott and Mark and the team and I spoke about this a lot previously, which is, if you start to look, so let me give you an example. So Tesla had an accident in China about 6 months ago, and they did the same thing the US government did. They said, give us, and it was actually a government official that was in the accident. They said, okay, let's do an investigation of this. Let's explore what happened, and let's have a conversation around this, just like, when Tesla has an accident in the US. So Tesla turned over all the data to the Chinese government. The Chinese government freaked out. So the Tesla vehicle had, video, sound, LiDAR, radar, everything on the outside of the vehicle in this vehicle. I'm not sure if it had LiDAR actually. And then inside the vehicle, it had cameras and audio recording the driver. So every conversation this government official had was being recorded by Tesla. And so another way to think about this is, everybody's always talking about like drones and how bad drones are. But if you think about it, in today's day and age, every single vehicle that's, level 3, level 4, level 5 is a drone. And so if you're China, you're going to say at some point, and I can talk about the downstream implications and how this correlated to the Didi battle with Didi going public when the government told them not to go public because they wanted to try to solve this problem first. But in essence, Teslas are now considered drones, right? And they are drones, just like your cell phone is a drone, right? So there's billions of drones being sold across the world by, US and Chinese companies, and one of which is a vehicle. So I think what you're going to see is vehicles are going to be increasingly viewed by governments as threats to their system. And that'll be both in the sense of them recording, but also in the sense that as they become increasingly autonomous, you can imagine the geopolitical risk of all Chinese cars, America having all Chinese cars that are autonomous, and some Chinese company just pushing a button and turning them off, or all Chinese cars being created by American companies and being turned off, or Saudi Arabia, et cetera. So I do believe nationalization of transportation is going to become very important, and you're going to see that companies are going to be less global in the autonomous vehicle space in the future. And then, of course, we'll have there'll be a lot of hiccups and road bumps for electric vehicles along the way as well, with shortage of supplies, disposal of these materials, right? So we don't allow for nuclear power because we don't know what to dispose of with the waste. But for some reason, we're going to be able to take 500 million cars per year that have batteries dying and figure out where to put those without any problem whatsoever, versus one nuclear core that probably could power all of those cars for a year. So those are I'll pause there, and we can open up to questions or whatever you want, Scott, answer questions. But I think that's a pretty good overview of my perspective on the history and where we are now and where we're heading.
Yeah, so Storm, I just got to say, I think that was an absolutely fascinating summary. And one of the things, and arguably, I'm in the financial services business as a venture capitalist, but I would say that unless you're in the business, and even many that are, don't understand sort of the dynamics that take place in the financial markets behind the scenes that impact the amount of capital that's available, company valuations, and all these things, that almost seem, uncorrelated with a particular company or what's taking place technologically. It's just a layer on top that the people operating these companies don't see. So with that takeaway, how do early stage companies go and raise capital in a smart way?
Yeah, I mean, for early stage capital, there's probably a number of different obstacles that you face. I don't think there's any lack of belief in the public or private markets about this, the size of this market. Either about the size of this market or about the potential disruption that's going to occur, right? So if you view this as a $7 to $12 trillion annual market, and you buy into my belief that it's a natural monopoly, the question is where is capital going to flow? I don't think, I see a lot of companies starting up companies to compete with Uber and Lyft, right? Like, oh, these high-end services, we're going to offer nicer cars, or a subscription service, where you're guaranteed the vehicle, et cetera. I think that's a tough battle to penetrate a network, right? From an autonomous vehicle perspective, we sold a company to Apple, a full stack autonomous vehicle company to Apple. And, they were doing extremely well. But then, I think investors started to realize that to be a full stack autonomous vehicle company and to compete with, Cruise that was funded by both GM and SoftBank or Waymo, or at that time Uber's program, it was just very difficult. And so it was very challenging to raise capital for a full stack hardware oriented company. So if you're a younger stage company, I think you're going to find capital be increasingly scarce for capital intensive. I'm going to actually switch things here because my battery's dying. Apologies.
Recording in progress.
Oop, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. So I think you're going to find it very challenging to get capital if you're going to compete with a network or you're going to compete on a hardware-oriented product, unless it's a subcomponent that's essential to the success of these things. So that's going to be where capital is going to probably flow, is for anything that's supportive. So what I mean by supportive is you're going to see the systems inside of cars become increasingly important, right? So interior entertainment, experiences within vehicles, will be important. Putting up a network of charging stations will be increasingly important. You'll be competing with some very powerful people that have network effects as well. But it's a pretty untapped space. So it's like, so ChargePoint and Tesla are probably the two biggest networks out there right now. But I think all of the affiliated services with that, like, so when your vehicle is getting charged, what else is happening? So services around that will become increasingly important. And then I think also the linkage of these services to other fields, right? So the autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles will eventually be delivering pretty much everything, in my mind. So right now they're just starting to begin to deliver food and groceries, as we all know, through Neuro and companies like that. But the increasing delivery of items, but delivering experiences, I believe, will be increasingly available. So you can see a future, and Starlink makes a lot of this possible as well. But you could see a distant future, not too distant future, where your vehicle, like an RV concept, right? So the young kids that don't believe that they really need to have some massive house and have that be the case, you could see a scenario where they have a vehicle that they sleep in as well, if it's autonomous, right? And so the vehicle, you after work, you hop in a car, it takes you out to out of town a little bit to a quote unquote RV park, for lack of a better way of putting it, an autonomous vehicle night park. And you sleep in that vehicle and then you come back in, right? So you can see companies like the major hotel change or Airbnb, which has already got some very similar experiences and tests going on along this market, doing that, renting out those those vehicles and systems and experiences. And like I said, it's not, there's already companies starting up that are developing vehicles for professionals, right? So they have desks in them and more workspace and have Wi-Fi, et cetera, right? So that's the concept of like, well, if I'm in a vehicle, and I have to go somewhere, it might as well have a desk in it and I can get some work done, right? It's not a big leap to think like, geez, it would be nice if there's a Peloton in there, or 2 Pelotons side by side, in a minivan, and you hop in there, when you come back, when you're, so my commute from my house to my office is 30 minutes, right? So you hop on that Peloton, you do a 30-minute Peloton ride and you're at work, right? And you either take a shower at work, or, maybe if you decide I'm going to move a little bit farther from town, it's an hour away, you do a 30-minute Peloton ride, then you switch to a, shower vehicle, right? So you can see experiences in vehicles. I'm just making up theoretical examples, experiences being focused. So I think that's where you're going to see some venture capital and growth-oriented money focus is okay, the technology in that game is now pretty far along, and it's hard to invest in that and get good returns. Now, what are the ancillary things that happen because of that technology?
Great, thank you. So here's another one. What's your perspective on the new Biden infrastructure bill and its possible impact on both private and public companies in the sector?
Yeah, I think this is a tough one to answer, and I'll tell you why I think it's a tough one to answer. Was people have lost a lot of faith in government over the last 4 or 8 years, right? And so I think this concept that government programs, so if you go from Obama to Trump and back to Biden, right? A lot of the Obama promises were unwound through the Trump administration, right? So it's if I'm a venture capitalist, I'm probably not banking on the sustainability of government promises at this point, because there's so much disparity where, a 51-49 or 49-51 electorate out there voting in presidents and Congress, et cetera. So it doesn't seem like it's something that's sustainable. So of course the Biden bill is going to be additive and helpful, right? We need more infrastructure in the US, which is a critical thing for all vehicles to survive. I mean, I remember traveling when I was younger to foreign countries and being like, wow, this is amazing how lucky I am to live in the United States compared to this, place. Now, when I go to a lot of these places, I'm like, wow, their roads are better than our roads. Their lighting at night is better than our lighting at night. It's really transition. We haven't invested in infrastructure. So that infrastructure is essential to the future of our, success of our transportation, and the investments around autonomy and electrification and the programs around that will be additive. It's much better than having, no programs in place. But I think it's going to be one of those things where people are going to try to develop models that transcend the Biden plan and then just try to capture as much of the Biden plan as possible.
Okay, here's a question. Talking about research at a particular academic institution suggests that without policy intervention, the trend towards AVs will be more personally owned, as compared to shared AVs. Are you assuming shared AVs will dominate in the market?
Yeah, that's a tough debate to answer, right? But I believe shared AVs and fleet-owned AVs will be the future. I mean, first of all the companies I'm speaking to are trying to figure out that aspect. Uber, of course, believes that off-balance sheet financing by individuals is better. I just don't see that as a sustainable future. First of all, Uber's drivers can't afford the vehicles. So, if you do the actual math on it, it's not a sustainable long-run plan for a financing of your fleet. And Uber knows that, and so there's a lot of people out there that are, looking at and exploring not just what they call fleet management right now, which is literally just the software to manage fleet. But a lot of them own those vehicles. Some of them just have decided to own the vehicles, and some of them are doing it for other people that own them. So my perspective is that it'll evolve into three different things. You'll have the network, and then you'll have the people that take care of the infrastructure of the network, and then you'll have the people that own the infrastructure of the network. So you'll have like GE Capital or someone will own the vehicles and the parking lots and the charging infrastructure. And then there'll be a set of service companies that come in and polish the car, remove the dents, clean it, refuel it, make sure the infrastructure is working, et cetera. And then there'll be a network company that's in charge of making sure people have access to that transportation. And the reason for that is it's very hard to compete with scale economics and things like insurance. The reason insurance companies exist is because one person, you don't have one company that owns all of the vehicles that are being driven in the U.S. currently, right? And so there's a lot of economics leaking out because of that inefficiency of every individual person having to own a vehicle, and that's how insurance company wins. But if all of a sudden all of those vehicles are owned by one company, the premium of insurance will accrue to the value of that company self-insuring or a company providing the insurance for that fleet. So just economically, macroeconomically, I just can't see a scenario where. So maybe the evolution is you start with a few rich people owning AVs, like the Tesla vehicle owners. But I think it quickly evolves to where a company has the ability to capture some of those economics from insurance. I think it was Jeff Bezos that said that, right? Your margins are my target, right? Are my business plan. And with insurance, there's a lot of leakage on insurance.
Mark, I think
especially as vehicles become safer, right? So in other words, if you're wealthy and you can afford a autonomous vehicle and it's safer, so your insurance rates are down, right? That's inimical to public policy.
Right.
Storm, this has been a really interesting conversation for me. I am not an investor. I rely on Scott to educate me in that space. I'm a technologist, but I wondered if you could speak to. I mean, a lot of the discussion's been around light duty applications in this talk thus far, and I wonder if we're seeing electrification into the medium duty and heavy duty space as well, and that trend. I wonder if you could speak to those two segments from an investor's perspective in terms of how you see those investment trends happening. I guess through the lens of hardware is very capital intensive, as you were speaking to earlier. Maybe you could opine about your thoughts in the medium and heavy duty space.
Yeah, it's been a space that's attracted more investor interest than people think, and it's probably been the most exciting one for investors. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and actually COVID actually helped with some of the reasoning around that as well. But one aspect of the reasoning is that there's a lot of regulations around. Truck drivers used to drive like 18, 20 hours a day, sleep 4 hours a day, and when a truck, it's the same concept of like when people die, they like to know that there's a reason why they die, amazingly, and then if that reason isn't legitimate, they try to change that, right? It's just how society works. And so if a truck driver gets into an accident and kills someone, or spills, toxic waste or whatever happens, and it's because he was sleeping 4 hours a day, that's not acceptable. So you put regulations in place for that, right? And that's what's happened, right? There's, technology has allowed us to track truck drivers and to see how much they're sleeping, right? Like, 20 years ago, if a truck driver said he was sleeping 10 hours a night, you'd be like, okay, I have no idea to prove that, so let's, that sounds great. Now you can definitely prove that, right? You can be like, I won't turn on your vehicle remotely. I'm filming you. I'm going to look at your eyelids to see if you're getting tired. I'm going to see Was your phone on all night? Were you out at the bar drinking? I can check your location. And so governments are saying like, you know what, we need to have more regulations around this. The truck driver can only drive this many hours per day, et cetera. And that will increasingly become more and more infringing because it's actually just unfair for truck drivers to have to drive more than that, right? It's kind of a tough form of labor, but it's also very dangerous to society. And so when those regulations came in place, a lot of softwares got involved around, that's where the original fleet management and telematics stuff, came in and got a lot of value. So all those guys came in to try to manage a program. And so that's what made autonomous vehicle efforts in that space much more appealing, which is like, okay, so this guy used to drive 20, he's driving 8. It was already very thin margins, right? So this is very, very difficult for the economy to have costs go up by 100% for transportation, which is not quite what happens in that scenario, but not too disparate either, right? From the services aspect of transportation. So autonomous vehicles became much more profitable in that space as a result of that. And then the pandemic made that worse, which is, one of the things that the administration was working on at the early part of the pandemic was called the Pandemic Security Plan. And that concept was, how do we assure that we have all of the food and necessary medical equipment we need during times of crisis internally inside the country? And one of those aspects was transportation. So they were meeting with a lot of the major food delivery companies, food supply companies, as well as transportation companies to solve this. And so from a regulatory perspective, it's to the government's advantage to encourage autonomous vehicles in the, in the both light and medium, both last mile and supply chain side of that. So you're going to see that, and then electrification. I still think that's just more of a peak oil and environmental policy decision. It doesn't really have to do as much with the truck drivers' time sheet. So I just think that part of it is not too dissimilar of a motivation from normal vehicles.
Okay, thank you for that one. So the one question is, maybe back to the basics. Do you feel that what's going on now is public market valuations driving private market valuations, or the other way around? And talk about, are they in sync or not? And when are they going to fall out of sync if they are in sync?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer right now, but it is a pendulum swing where it goes back and forth on which are valued more highly. It's like 4 or 5 years ago, private market valuations in this space were valued more highly than public market valuations. And now that's clearly the opposite, which is why everyone is trying to get public through a SPAC vehicle if you're an autonomous or electric vehicle company. But right the last handful of months, it's really slowed down for autonomous electric vehicle companies, but there's been some big successes. We have Rivian. I'm sure this group knows about that coming up. Actually, might have even happened. I can't even remember. It's right around this time frame. Argo is trying to get public. So there's a number of these vehicles or these larger, more successful and backed companies trying to get public right now. So I would say the public market valuations always drive private market valuations over the long run, even though there's periods of disconnect between the two of them. The periods of disconnect tend to occur when people see a large TAM and a network effects business available. And then the public market valuations catch up to that usually, but that's typically the stringer thing, which is a pendulum. And when the private market's ahead of the public markets, it's just because the private markets see something that the public markets haven't caught on to yet. But in general, the private markets will never invest to a company that can't exit at a higher valuation that they invest in. So that's not a sustainable long-term thing if the public markets are right about lower valuations.
Right, great. So, audience, we've just got a few minutes left. If you have any last questions, please put them in to the Q&A. And I've got one here. Let's see. I don't think that one's a good one. Sorry, I had to play host and edit it out. I'll answer it otherwise. Let's see. Oh yeah, so here's one. Again, back to the basics. Probably from an early stage company's perspective, what's important for them to do to be able to raise capital at the best valuation? And I said best, not necessarily highest, because that's sort of a secondary question. Should you take as much money as you can at the highest valuation, or maybe that's not the right thing to do?
Yeah. So two things I would say, you know, most people don't understand private market valuations. They just think like, that you put something on a napkin and then you bring it to someone and it's a binary decision. It's either like, get out of here, this makes no sense, or wow, this is amazing. Here's $10 million, and next thing you know, you're a billionaire, right? That's kind of like the popular view as to how it works. In reality, things have evolved significantly. So there's two broad types of paintbrushes that I can paint. If you have a product that requires a lot of users to be on it, a network type product, it's very difficult to raise money from anyone other than friends and family, even in this market environment, until you prove that you've been able to get some customers on there. And when I say some customers, like if you go out and you build a game, if you're a kid and you go out and build a game and you have 10,000 users on that game, you're not going to raise capital from anyone other than your mom, right? Because in today's day and age, you need 1 million people. But if you go out and you build your game and you have 1 million people are going to be calling you up unsolicited. You can get, all the investment in the world. But it's very rare now, unless you've started a company before, that you can go out and raise capital based upon an idea. So if it's an idea that has, or if it's a company that you started to build and it's got significant growth and traction in users, you'll get capital. On the enterprise side, so that's the consumer side or small, medium business side. On the enterprise side, there's probably a couple of things you need to do, but you need validation from one customer. So if you build a technology, you either have to prove, if you build a technology and it's obvious that the benefit of that technology. So let me give you an example. Let's say you build an AI interpretation device for LiDAR. Right. And you show it to the VC and it's like, okay, here's 10 different LiDAR devices, from, Velodyne and, all of the, Innoviz, et cetera. Right. I line them up and here's the raw data coming from that LiDAR on the screen. You see the LiDAR and here's now me plugging in my program. And you can now see it turns that LiDAR image into something that even a human can recognize. Right. You're like, holy moly, that actually looks like a video camera view. Right. And then it identifies, it's like, that's a car. That's a 48-year-old single woman. I'm exaggerating, right? But your AI, you look at that as a software, that software as an investor, and you're like, holy moly, that would be game changing for autonomous vehicles. And I don't need to have customer validation. I can see already that is. I know that product is needed, right? We need better interpretation of LiDAR data, right? Because it's coming in so fast and it's so data intensive. And then the third aspect of that is if you already have a customer, right? So if you're building an enterprise technology, you have to have a technology where the technology is proven, and ideally you have a customer, unless it's so painstakingly obvious that the technology you're creating works and will have a customer set. So those are the two different categories, the consumer versus enterprise. And prior to that, you're either getting investment from someone that believes in you, like, friends and family, or, maybe it happens to be that you were at GM and their venture wing, heard from, you spoke to their venture wing and they spoke to your boss and you're like, yeah, this guy's creating something that we need, right? So there has to be some connection to you to get that initial capital. Once you prove it, then once you have customers and prove it, then it's very easy to get capital.
Yeah. So Storm, thanks so much. I mean, I could just keep, going on for a while here, but, we've drawn up to the end of the hour. I appreciate you taking the time, your time, and the audience, appreciate your time. Catherine, do you want to wrap up here? Or Mark?
Absolutely. If Mark is all done, I can definitely close us out.
Yes, thank you, Storm.
Yep. Okay. So
Thank you all.
Thanks, Storm. For more information about the California Mobility Center, other than the big sign behind Mark, go to californiamobilitycenter.org. And we are not the hospital supply company. I think they actually, have closed down. So, click down to the next one, you'll find us, and that's where a lot of information can be provided. Thank you for your attendance. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you next month. Have a good day.
Thank you. Once you exit the webinar, please take a moment to complete the short survey that will pop up on your screen. A follow-up email will be sent to all attendees with a link to the report. Thank you. This concludes today's CMC webinar.